Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm very aware that I'm the person standing between you all and dinner after a very long but very enriching couple of days. But lucky for you all, I'm a fast-talking Irish woman, so I won't keep you too long. But I'm here today, as mentioned, I'm a sociologist. Thank you. So I'm a bit of an interloper here, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the rise of work time reduction and the extent to which it's having its moment, so to speak, in terms of a cultural phenomenon, policy proposals, and experiments. I also want to talk a little bit about how work time reduction might be part of one of several eco-social policies that can help us to try and move forward to a more sustainable and progressive economy by addressing things like work-life balance and other social outcomes. I'm going to speak specifically about gender inequality here. I think Till has talked about equality more generally, and I hope we get to talk about that more maybe at a macro level in the questions section. And then I'll talk briefly about overconsumption, which I think links back a little bit to Bob's talks. So to get started, again, I won't spend too long. Till has already touched on this, but in an effort to ingratiate myself with you economists, I decided to put a very well-known economist up on my slide. So as already mentioned, he predicted that the standard of living in progressive countries would be 4 to 8 times higher by 1930, and that we would be down to about a 15-hour working week. Again, as already mentioned, he was right about the standard of life, by and large, in high-income nations. If we take life expectancy, for example, as a good proxy for health and other standard of living outcomes, with a couple of blips of wars and different forms of armed races and pandemics and so on, we've generally seen a pretty upward trend in this, plateauing off more recently. Similarly, again, already mentioned, due to technology and other things, productivity per hour worked has also gone up, stagnated a little bit more recently, but compared to, say, 1930, that graph's from 1950, again, we've seen these massive gains. So why then, if we are almost at 2030, are we still at a standard 40-hour working week, at least for those in standard contracts? So again, this kind of points to the earlier presentation. We have seen some progress in terms of reallocating the gains in productivity from capital to the worker in the European context due to collective bargaining. So in France, for example, between 1997 and 2000, the working week was reduced from 39 hours to 35. In Germany, at the sectoral level, again, after many strikes in the 1980s, that sector managed to negotiate a 35-hour week. And we see lots of models for reduced working time in the Nordic countries, of course. So for example, and most recently, the largest scale trial that then, public sector trial, that then was transposed into collective bargaining agreement was in Iceland, where the government went from a standard 40-hour week to a 35 or to 36-hour week. And an important thing about this experiment is it included police officers, social workers, many of the professions that it's going to be more challenging to transition to working lower working time, if that is the path we're going to see. In the 1970s and 80s, we did actually see a little bit of a 4-day working week in certain sectors, but this was work time compression, where people did 10-hour days as opposed to work time reduction, which is what we're talking about now. So we might expect in liberal European countries to see arguments for working time reduction, and particularly in the context of strong collective bargaining. But actually, in the post-pandemic era, we are also seeing calls for the reduction of standard working hours from corners that we mightn't expect. So there are government-supported trials happening in the moment in Scotland. They're having a public sector trial. South Cambridgeshire in the UK had a trial that just wrapped up was politicized. We can talk about that later. Valencia in Spain had a month-long public sector trial last year, and they've actually taken, the federal government in Spain has taken another tact whereby they're providing 10 million in support to small to medium enterprises to offset the costs of trialing reduced work time in their organizations. And then we also see in the US context, Bernie Sanders and the California governor, Mark Takano, as well, tabled bills at Congress to reduce the standard working time, statutory reduction of 32 hours. They weren't successful, but nonetheless, you know, I think it says something about the cultural and political moment that these bills are getting as far as they are. Oh, and just to get back, this lovely gentleman with the hat, billionaire Steve Cohen has talked about how he expects, this is just a quote from earlier this year, to see the 4-day working week very soon because of the rise of AI. We see the head of Zoom, another billionaire, saying something similar. So again, the kind of Bernie Sanders corners, but also we're seeing it from these maybe more unusual individuals. Okay, so I am here to talk a little bit about the 4-day week global trials. So I'm a co-investigator on these trials. They are basically private sector trials that have taken place across a variety of national contexts. I've got a slide on that next. And they are coordinated by a non-profit called 4-day week global. So for any of you that have not heard of this, Andrew Barnes was a successful businessman in New Zealand. He and his wife implemented in a variety of their operations a reduced work time schedule, so gains in productivity, you know, worker retention, many benefits, and decided to kind of make it their mission to support other organizations that wanted to pursue the same path. So they provide organizations with this kind of onboarding support where they're kind of teamed up with other organizations for learning and mentorship about how you do this, how you go about work reorganization and other things to reduce the working time. And then we provide research support. So Juliet Shore, my colleague, is the principal investigator. She's at Boston College. And we collaborate with others at Cambridge University and other universities. So I'm representing the many here. So the key thing to remember here is that this is, Andrew Barnes actually trademarked this, it's the 180-100 model. So basically, employees keep 100% of the pay, they work for 80% of the time, and they have to commit to 100% of organizational goals. Or keep productivity at, another way to say it, at that level. And then organizations self-select into this. So they don't go out looking for companies. They kind of say, like, this service is available. The trials are actually finished now, but they kind of advertise, I guess, in a way, or there's publicity that this support is available. Organizations that have maybe been toying with this idea come forward. We provide research support. Okay. So what do we do in terms of the research? So it's a mixed method study. We did employer surveys. We tried to get the employers to send us monthly data on absenteeism, productivity, and many other metrics. As any of you who've done field research will know, this was a challenge. Then we also did employee surveys. So we did 3 waves of employee surveys, pre, during, and post. We also did a time use diary where the employees recreated their most recent day off. And we did interviews with employers and employees at the end to figure out lessons learned and so on. So the trial the waves that I'm going to talk about today are in the Anglophone countries, so waves 1 to 5, and they ran basically from February 2022 on to March 2023. So subsequently it's been rolled out in Brazil and I think a couple of others, but I'm just going to talk about these countries today. There was 3,500 employees or a bit more on the trial, but we didn't get complete data for all of them. I think a really important point to note here is that this isn't a representative sample in terms of sector, right? This doesn't claim to be. These are organizations that opted in. they weren't paid to do so. So they naturally are going to be the kind of early adopters, basically, of organizations that want to try something different, and probably those organizations that are able to adapt most easily, office-based workers and so on. Now, we did have like a fish and chip shop in the UK, and there was an interesting case of a manufacturing company in Ireland, so there was some differences, but by and large, these were office-based workers. Okay, so if we're in this polycrisis, is work time reduction part of the solution? For work-life balance, spoiler alert, it's a pretty easy one, yes. So there is a wealth of public health data that already exists to show that long working hours causes all kinds of issues. So I'm talking to a room of academics. I'm sure I don't have to tell any of you that you get all kinds of problems when you're sitting at your desk all day. You're not moving. You make poor health choices. You're less likely to exercise. It can cause issues in relationships, children, etc. And then if you are not lucky enough to be sitting at a cushy desk and instead are in a high intensity or a kind of work that you can get repetitive strain and other things, or there's loud noises, then of course the time under tension, your exposure to these risks is even worse. And existing data already existed from countries in Korea and Japan and France and Portugal, where there was this statutory reduction in the 90s that showed gains in well-being when work time was reduced. And we saw gains in work-life balance and quality of leisure in Iceland in that most recent trial. So in our data, so we had full data for these waves for 2,134 employees across 123 organizations. We looked at a variety of outcome variables of well-being. So we looked at burnout, job satisfaction, positive affect, how happy are you, physical health and mental health. So these are all self-rated. We rooted our theories and our hypotheses in the job demands resource theory, which is builds on the work of Karsak. Basically, our hypotheses, informed by all this existing data, was that employees' well-being outcomes will improve by the endpoint, that the greater the reduction in work time, the bigger the gains over their 6-month trial, and that we expect these relationships to be mediated by resources. So we're kind of taking that term from the job demands and resource theory. So the kernel of this is, okay, you have the more demands in your job, the worse your well-being. And the idea with reduced work time, you're there less, so the demands are less. And then resources, the more resources you have, the better you're able to cope with those demands. Likewise, work time reduction also helps with that because you can sleep, have more leisure time, and you're better able to deal with the demands of your job. So we did mixed effects regression models with employees nested within organizations. We had a comprehensive set of covariates. We have a working paper out on this if anybody wants to investigate this further, and including a lag-dependent variable of the well-being measure at baseline. So if we look at these kind of 5 outcomes in terms of well-being, so there was variation in how much time people reduced their work. This wasn't a clean experiment. So it was a field experiment. So organizations varied in how stringently they enforced it. Employees within organizations varied with how much time they took. And now we did see the modal time of work went down from 40 to 33 hours. So it did happen, but the mean was something like 35 hours. So there's a lot of variation, particularly in the US context. So we see gains in all the things we'd like to see gains in from a well-being perspective, and reductions in all the things that we would hope to see reductions in. The kind of least robust result was for physical health, which again is in keeping with the literature because that kind of takes more time to have an effect. We do have a control group data now, which isn't in this. We have each of these groups is a group that reduced 8 hours or more, 5 to 7 hours. You can see it at the bottom there, 1 to 4 hours. And the comparison group is those people. So about 20% of the sample didn't really reduce their work time at all, and a couple actually increased. So that's where the comparisons are coming from there. That's the reference, the no change group. Okay, so in terms of inequality, I'm going to focus looking at gender inequality. Of course, there's broader macro-level inequality questions here in terms of sectors and rollout and so on. So there's a big literature from work and organizations to show that gender inequality, the gender wage gap still exists. Increasingly, that's turning into the motherhood wage gap. whereby from sociologists love our theory, so we have the ideal worker norm and this family devotion norm, whereby women in professional and managerial positions where long hours are performative, basically, of dedication to your job. Those are caring responsibilities, not men, but women continually struggle to meet those. And they're internally conflicted, and it has issues in terms of women's career progression. They go into mommy track jobs, as we call them in the US. They're more likely to do part-time work, etc., etc. So the part of this issue in the workforce is, of course, stemming from the household. So women are doing more household work still than men in every country around the world to various degrees. And this gets worse at the onset of children. And we saw this really clearly in the recession. In the US, they called it the she-session, because so many women left the workforce because creches closed, preschool, daycares, and the care infrastructure just wasn't there. And while existing work-life balance initiatives exist, so the right to work 4 days with a reduction of pay or something like that, so different flexibility options, they are limited in terms of who opts for these. By and large, it's mothers, not fathers. So we see this kind of at the household level, we see the same kind of patterns in terms of the gender division of labour, and then the kind of stunted progression in the workforce too. And we see this really clearly in terms of what workers think themselves as well. So the British Social Attitude Survey, for example, almost a third of workers thought that they would be looked upon badly if they were to request some kind of work-life balance option. Okay, so again, same data set. I'm just going to give you a snapshot here, but I'm writing a paper at the moment looking at the gender dynamics of how work time reduction was experienced differently by men and women, by parents, and by the age of their children. We would like to disaggregate more by same-sex relationships, by sexual orientation, race, and so on, but we haven't managed to do that in these analyses because just our sample is not diverse enough. So we investigated how reduced work time affected perceptions of work-life balance, time use patterns, including time spent on childcare, household chores, cooking, other care, and satisfaction with time use across these domains. And the satisfaction one is an interesting piece. I'm not going to present on it today, but it's because of these conflicting norms, particularly among mothers who tend to be in these professional sectors and are trying to perform in the same way of those people who don't have the same caring responsibilities, are engaging in intensive parenting, their sense of satisfaction with time is extremely low because they don't feel like they're performing in the workforce, they don't feel like they're performing in the household. So kind of it gets to some of the nuance of how work time reduction is experienced differently depending on your social location. So I'm just going to present on hypothesis A and B here. So we expected that all trial participants, in addition to the gains in well-being we saw in the other paper, will see gains in perceptions of work-life balance. And we thought that the largest gains might be among women whose children were under 7, so preschooler kids, because we know for women who work full-time, mothers who work full-time, that tends to be the most, it's challenging for parents overall, but women have the lowest levels of perceived work-life balance and time stress during this period. So as expected, we kind of see here, these are just simple t-tests to show these are 4 domains of work-life balance. So family represents how easily you can balance family and work responsibility. Social represents how easily you can balance your social life and your work life. Concentration, the question was how often do you find you can't concentrate and work because of your responsibilities at home? And the tiredness is how often are you too tired to do what's expected of you at home because of work. So again, we see parents have higher levels of these kind of challenges in work-life balance, worse for women than for men. But the gains that we see so everybody experiences gains in terms of being better able to balance work and family and care and social life, being on the reduced work time trial. And then the largest gains we see among bigger gains among women, who, as I said at the start, had kind of lower scores. So in a way, we're kind of getting at some of this inequality here. This is a model. These are odds ratios, just looking at these four. So these are, the previous slide was just t-test. This is our models. And again, I've just highlighted in gray the groups that who had the largest odds of experiencing like better social, being better able to manage social and work life, or for the family and occupation models 3 and 4, the lower the score is better. So you're less likely to report higher rates of burnout. So again, all of the methodology and everything is in the working paper if you want to look, but the key takeaway here, I'm aware it's very late, is what I've highlighted in gray. So the biggest gain, we did see bigger gains, we did see gains among everybody. The magnitude of these gains were larger among women, but actually for balancing social life and care work, actually was women without children who saw. They were 10 times more likely to say that they're better able to do that. As a mother myself, I can see they probably just have a better social life, so that's probably some of the explanatory factors there. And then we saw big gains, and this is with sleep as well, this isn't in this model, but for women with children aged 7 to 18 in the household. And again, so the hypothesis 1B was not proven, but again, this kind of makes sense in terms of the intensity of parenting. Any of you who have young children, there's not much you can do to mitigate against that in those younger years. Okay, and then the very last point, I would just want to touch on overconsumption. I'm an environmental sociologist, so I've come at this, I also study gender, but I was really interested in the environmental component of this, which was touched on earlier. So, when we talk about how work time reduction is going to help with environmental outcomes, we often talk about scale and compositional effects. So, like the previous presentation, when we talk about work time as an input into GDP, and then we know, there's been some decoupling of emissions, but overall, the bigger your economy, generally the bigger the environmental impacts. So that's one kind of pathway of the relationship between work time reduction and environmental indicators. In terms of consumption, what I'm just going to talk a little bit here today, the kind of easier bit to grasp, I guess, is when people work less, they might have a drop in income, which will change spending patterns. And again, that has an impact, lower consumption, better environmental indicators. But in our trial, that isn't the case, at least in the short term. So what we're looking at is time use patterns and expenditure patterns. So this comes from, if we think of, so my collaborator in this project, Juliet Shore, has written about this for decades, about the overworked American, and among other things, and about how we're in this work to spend, particularly in Anglophone UK, US countries, where people are just working nonstop to, buy these positional goods, among other things. And the idea is that working time reduction can disrupt this in a couple of ways. People have more time to invest in things that are less carbon intensive, so you're not buying, you have time to make your lunch and maybe bring it in over the week. You're not commuting as much. We did see that, a drop in commute times in the global data set. Yeah, just done. But the idea is that there's also a cultural shift here, that this could be part of a kind of broader move away from this ideal worker model, from this kind of growth and consumption-based economy, that kind of this disrupts this in a way. And in COVID, the pandemic has helped that. The taken for granted notion of how our economy has to be, how we have to work, really got disrupted there. And I think that's one of the reasons why this work time reduction kind of policy is getting so much traction at the moment. This is just a small slide in terms of consumption. So this is just Ireland. So this is about 150 or 170 employees. And we did look at pro-environmental behavior, the extent to which they engaged in consumptive-based pro-environmental behavior, so recycling, buying eco-friendly products, so a marginal increase here, encouraging others or educating oneself on the environment. We saw an increase here too. And actually in Ireland, we had a control group, so we saw significant changes here and not among the control group. And actually people didn't spend time volunteering, but this is actually something that came up in the interviews a lot, particularly in the UK. this is from the global sample, and this is really where what I was getting at in terms of changing consumption patterns and time use patterns, the day off. What we found by and large is people are spending their day off doing hobbies. So the extent to which this working time reduction will affect consumption is really down to the context, sociologists love context, under which these eco-social policies are really implemented. So if everybody's on a three-day weekend and Ryanair taxes continue not to be taxed, then we might see gains in emissions, right? It has to be it's part of the solution, I guess, in this way, but only within a broader kind of suite of policies. So that's just a kind of summing up. It must be part of a broader suite of ecological measures, and something that I didn't get to talk about, but is really going to be the challenge going forward in thinking about how do we broaden this in a more equitable way in terms of the sectors. We need the government here. It has to be kind of a statutory reduction, and that might mean different kinds of jobs. So I'm just going to finish on this because I'm the last speaker of the whole thing. I started on Keynes talking about his grandchildren. This is where our children and grandchildren, this is from the IPCC report of where we're headed in terms of warming. And any policy, we are desperately in need of understanding and, I guess, brave leadership in terms of progressive policies. Studying work time reduction has been so interesting for me in this regard because I think it's one of the few policies where, I mean, if I was a policymaker, I'd be grabbing at it, where there's kind of these gains in well-being, and we don't see there is possibilities for also gains in environmental outcomes, which is pretty rare. So if you're interested or you do study work time reduction, it's not on the slide, we do have a network, my colleagues and I, it's the Work Time Reduction Research Network, so if you or any of your students or anybody are working on this area, do join it. Okay, thank you everybody.